a dying breath, a whisper on the deathbed. Words that seemed like delirious rambling, but what if they were prophecy? The year is 14 AD. Gaius Octavianus Augustus, the first Roman emperor, lies dying in Nola. As his final moments approach, he speaks a cryptic phrase that witnesses would later record with trembling hands. For decades, scholars dismissed these words as the confused mutterings of a fevered mind. They were wrong. What Augustus spoke in his final breath wasn't madness. It was a vision that would unfold with terrifying precision across the centuries. A prediction so specific, so haunting, that when it finally came to pass 500 years later, it would shake the very foundations of an empire that once seemed eternal. Tonight, we uncover the mystery of Augustus's last words. What did the dying emperor truly say? Why did scribes hide the full account for generations? And how did his whispered prophecy become reality in the most unexpected way imaginable? The answer lies buried in ancient texts, concealed by time and fear, but the truth has a way of surfacing, even after 5 centuries of silence. Some words are too powerful to die with their speaker. To understand the weight of Augustus's final words, we must first grasp the magnitude of the man who spoke them. Gaius Octavianus began his ascent to power as merely the adopted son of Julius Caesar, a youth of 18 when the dictator fell to assassins' blades in 44 BC. Yet from this precarious position, he would orchestrate one of history's most remarkable transformations, reshaping not only his own destiny but the very nature of Roman civilization. The rise of Octavian reads like a masterclass in political cunning and strategic patience. Through the blood-soaked years of civil war, he eliminated rivals with methodical precision. Mark Antony, his former ally, fell at Actium in 31 BC, leaving Octavian as the sole master of the Mediterranean world. But where others had seized power through force and lost it through violence, Octavian understood that true dominance required a more subtle approach. In 27 BC, he performed what appeared to be an act of supreme magnanimity. He returned power to the Senate and people of Rome. This calculated gesture of humility earned him the title Augustus, the revered one, and marked the birth of the Roman Empire under a carefully constructed fiction of restored republic. Augustus had achieved what no strongman before him could: absolute power wrapped in the comforting illusion of traditional governance. The era that followed became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For 45 years, Augustus ruled over an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Cities flourished under imperial protection, trade routes carried wealth across continents, and Roman law provided stability to millions of diverse peoples. The emperor himself became more than a ruler. He transformed into a living symbol of divine order, his image adorning temples from Gaul to Asia Minor. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay a more complex reality. Augustus ruled through a delicate balance of tradition and innovation, republican forms and imperial substance. He understood that power in Rome had always been as much about perception as reality, as much about the right words spoken at the right moment as about legions and gold. In Roman culture, words possessed almost mystical significance. They could bind gods, seal fates, and shape destinies. This reverence for the power of speech reached its apex in the Roman understanding of last words. The final utterances of great men were not mere personal expressions but acts of historical significance, carrying weight that could influence generations. The deathbed pronouncements of leaders were carefully recorded, analyzed, and preserved as windows into divine will or cosmic truth. Romans believed that in the moment of death, when the soul prepared to depart, mortals could glimpse truths hidden from the living. The tradition stretched back centuries. Cicero's defiant words before his execution, Caesar's alleged et tu, Brute. As he fell, the last philosophical observations of Stoic emperors, all were preserved not as curiosities but as profound statements about the nature of power, duty, and fate. For Augustus, whose entire reign had been built upon the careful management of symbols and meanings, his final words would inevitably carry extraordinary significance. When Augustus fell ill in August of 14 AD during his journey through Campania, the empire held its collective breath. He had ruled for longer than many citizens could remember. His death would mark not just the end of a life but the conclusion of an epoch. as he lay dying in the villa at Nola where his father had died decades earlier. Every word he spoke was carefully noted by attendants, scribes, and family members who understood they were witnessing history. The ancient historians who recorded these final moments approached their task with the gravity it deserved. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, writing nearly a century later, drew upon court records and eyewitness accounts to reconstruct the emperor's last days. His account presents Augustus as lucid to the end, concerned with practical matters of succession and the continuity of imperial administration. According to Suetonius, the emperor's final recorded words were a request for applause. "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I make my exit." Yet this theatrical flourish, while perfectly in character for a man who had spent his life performing the role of benevolent ruler, was not the only account that survived. Dio Cassius, writing his Roman history in the early 3rd century, preserved different traditions. In his version, Augustus spoke more cryptically about the future of the empire, mentioning visions and portents that troubled his final hours. Most intriguingly, fragments survive from Tacitus's lost books of the Annals, preserved through later citations and scattered references. These suggest that Augustus's final words included elements that the other historians either missed or deliberately omitted, phrases that seemed to reference events far beyond his own time, speaking of darkness returning to the 7 hills and the light of Rome being extinguished by its own children. The discrepancies between these accounts have puzzled scholars for centuries. Were the historians recording different moments, different conversations during Augustus's final illness? Were some accounts later embellished or corrupted? Or were certain elements deliberately suppressed because they proved too unsettling, too prophetic, too dangerous to preserve in their complete form? What remains consistent across all sources is that Augustus's final words included references to future events that seemed, at the time, to make little sense. He spoke of temples that did not yet exist being destroyed, of gods whose names were unknown in Rome being worshipped in secret, of an empire that would face its greatest test not from barbarian invasions but from the abandonment of its own sacred traditions. These references became the subject of intense speculation among scholars and priests in the decades following Augustus's death. Some dismissed them as the fevered imaginings of a dying mind. Others saw in them the genuine prophetic insight that Romans believed could manifest in the final moments of life. But as the years passed and the empire continued to flourish under Augustus's successors, the mysterious elements of his last words faded from active memory, relegated to the footnotes of historical texts and the musty archives of scholarly debate. It was only centuries later, when the very foundations of Roman civilization began to shift, that historians would look back at these half-remembered prophecies with new understanding. In the dying light of the Western Empire, scholars would recognize with growing unease that Augustus's cryptic final words had not been the delusions of a fevered mind. They had been an unervingly accurate vision of Rome's distant future. The final confirmed detail recorded by all sources was perhaps the most haunting. After speaking his prophetic words, Augustus fell silent for several hours, his eyes fixed on something beyond the room, beyond the present moment. When questioned by his physicians, he could only whisper that he saw shadows gathering where light should be, and that the old gods were departing while new ones waited in hidden places. Then, as if a curtain had fallen across his vision, he returned to the mundane concerns of imperial succession and administrative detail. But those present would later recall that his eyes retained a distant, troubled quality until the moment of his death, as if he had glimpsed something that should not yet have been revealed. But what exactly had Augustus seen in those final hours? What knowledge had been granted to the dying emperor that would prove so unervingly accurate 5 centuries later? The villa at Nola stood shrouded in morning mist on August 19, 14 AD. Within its marble walls, the most powerful man in the world lay dying, attended by a carefully selected circle of witnesses whose very presence would shape the historical record for centuries to come. The emperor's bedchamber had been transformed into a stage for imperial succession, yet also into something far more mysterious, a repository of secrets that would vanish with the dawn. Livia Augusta, the emperor's wife of 52 years, maintained her vigil beside the bed with the stoic composure that had made her the true power behind the throne. Her weathered hands, still elegant despite her 70 years, held the wax tablets on which the emperor's words were being recorded. Beside her stood the Praetorian prefect, his armor dulled to avoid unseemly gleaming in the presence of death, and 3 scribes whose styluses moved with practiced precision across their parchments. The Sacred College of Priests had dispatched their most senior members to witness the emperor's final moments. These men, guardians of Rome's most ancient traditions, understood that they were present not merely to perform last rites, but to preserve whatever divine revelations might emerge from the threshold between life and death. Their presence lent an air of religious solemnity to proceedings that were simultaneously deeply personal and profoundly political. As the morning progressed, Augustus drifted between lucidity and fevered sleep. During his clearer moments, he attended to the practical matters of succession with characteristic attention to detail. He confirmed Tiberius as his heir, issued final instructions regarding provincial administration, and dictated letters to distant governors. These mundane communications were carefully noted by the scribes, their quills scratching across parchment in the measured rhythm of official documentation. Yet it was during these seemingly routine exchanges that the first disturbing elements emerged. Between instructions about grain shipments and military postings, Augustus began to speak of things that had no obvious connection to imperial business. He mentioned temples that did not exist, describing their architecture with unsettling precision. He spoke of gods whose names the priests did not recognize, referring to sacred rituals that bore no resemblance to Roman practice. The scribes continued their transcription, but their styluses hesitated. Were these the wanderings of a fevered mind, or was the emperor speaking of matters beyond their comprehension? The priests exchanged glances but remained silent, their training teaching them to respect the mysteries that might be revealed in the proximity of death. As the sun reached its zenith, Augustus called for the chamber to be cleared of all but his most intimate attendants. The scribes were dismissed, their partially completed transcripts gathered by Livia's personal servants. The Praetorian Guard withdrew to the corridor, leaving only the emperor's wife, his personal physician, and a single trusted freedman who had served the imperial household for decades. What transpired during this private audience would become the subject of speculation for generations. The freedman, bound by oath to absolute discretion, would take his knowledge to the grave. The physician, similarly sworn to secrecy, left only the most clinical notes about the emperor's physical condition. Only Livia would emerge from that chamber with knowledge of Augustus's final, private words, and she would guard that knowledge with a silence more impenetrable than any tomb. When the others were readmitted to the chamber, they found Augustus in a state of profound agitation. His eyes, which had grown dim with approaching death, now burned with an intensity that unnerved even his closest associates. He spoke rapidly in a voice that seemed to carry from a great distance, as if the words were being transmitted through him rather than originating from his own thoughts. The content of these final public utterances would be preserved in multiple contradictory versions. Some witnesses would later claim that Augustus spoke in the theatrical manner that had characterized his public life, asking whether he had played his role well and requesting applause for his exit. This account, polished and dramatically satisfying, would find its way into Suetonius's historical narrative and become the version most widely accepted by later generations. But other witnesses recorded darker material. According to these accounts, Augustus spoke of a great apostasy that would come to pass in the distant future. He described the abandonment of the gods who had made Rome great, the rise of foreign deities who would claim dominion over the 7 hills, and the eventual collapse of the old order under the weight of its own contradictions. These prophecies, spoken in a voice that observers described as not entirely his own, seemed to reference events so remote that they held no immediate relevance to the gathered witnesses. Most disturbing of all were the emperor's references to underground sanctuaries where forbidden rites would be performed, where Roman soldiers would kneel before altars dedicated to gods of distant lands, and where the very foundations of imperial loyalty would be undermined by secret allegiances to deities whose names were unknown in the capital. He spoke of a time when the empire's strength would be turned against itself, when the guardians of Roman tradition would become the agents of its transformation. As these unsettling words filled the chamber, something unprecedented occurred. Livia, who had remained silent throughout the emperor's public proclamations, rose from her chair and approached the bed. In a voice that carried absolute authority, She commanded the scribes to cease their transcription. The official record, she declared, would end with the emperor's practical instructions regarding succession and administration. The scribes, trained in absolute obedience to imperial will, set down their styluses. The priests, recognizing the political necessity of Livia's intervention, bowed their heads in acquiescence. Whatever words Augustus spoke in his final moments would not be preserved in the official chronicles of his reign. The empress had drawn a veil of silence over the most mysterious and potentially dangerous elements of her husband's deathbed revelations. Within hours of Augustus's death, the official transcripts were edited, copied, and distributed throughout the empire. The version that reached provincial governors, military commanders, and historical chroniclers contained only the sanitized account of a dying emperor's final administrative duties and theatrical farewell. The more troubling elements, the prophecies, the references to unknown gods, the descriptions of future apostasy, were excised from the record with surgical precision. Yet rumors persisted among those who had been present in the chamber. Whispered conversations in the corridors of power hinted at words that had been deemed too dangerous for preservation. The priests, bound by religious oath to maintain confidentiality, nevertheless struggled with the implications of what they had witnessed. Had they observed genuine divine revelation, or had they witnessed the fevered imaginings of a dying mind? The ambiguity tormented them, but their vows of silence remained unbroken. The original transcripts, containing the complete and unedited record of Augustus's final words, disappeared from the imperial archives within days of his death. Some claimed they had been destroyed on Livia's orders, burned in the sacred flames of Vesta's temple to ensure their complete obliteration. Others whispered that they had been hidden away in some secret repository, preserved for future generations who might better understand their significance. Decades passed, and the mystery of Augustus's final words faded from active memory. The empire continued to flourish under his successors, and the practical concerns of administration and conquest overshadowed the half-remembered prophecies of a dying emperor. The sanitized version of his death became accepted history, while the darker elements were relegated to the realm of rumor and speculation. Yet, in the deepest archives of the imperial palace, certain documents remained carefully preserved. Fragmentary references in administrative records, marginal notes in official correspondence, and the private journals of court officials contained hints of the suppressed material. These scattered references, meaningless to contemporary readers, would await discovery by scholars of a later age who would recognize their significance only when the emperor's prophetic words had begun to manifest in reality. The silence that surrounded Augustus's true final words was not born of mere political expediency. It was the silence of those who had glimpsed something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding. A vision of the future that was both impossible to believe and too unsettling to ignore. In protecting the empire from the potential chaos of premature revelation, they had also ensured that the truth would remain buried until the moment when it could no longer be denied. But in Rome, even the most carefully guarded secrets have a way of surfacing, and the shadows that Augustus had seen gathering at the edge of his vision were already beginning to take shape in the hidden corners of his empire. In the centuries following Augustus's death, scholars have proposed numerous explanations for the mysterious circumstances surrounding his final words. Each theory carries its own weight of evidence, its own logical framework, and its own troubling implications. The truth, if it exists at all, lies buried beneath layers of political manipulation, historical revision, and the simple passage of time. The literary embellishment theory, the most academically accepted explanation, dismisses the entire mystery as a creation of later historians. According to this view, Augustus's final words were nothing more than literary flourishes added by biographers who sought to provide a dramatically satisfying conclusion to the emperor's life story. The theatrical request for applause, "Have I played the part well?" fits perfectly with this interpretation, offering a poetic summary of a life spent performing the role of benevolent ruler. Proponents of this theory point to the well-documented tendency of ancient historians to invent speeches and conversations that captured the essence of their subjects' characters, even when no reliable record of the actual words existed. Suetonius, in particular, was known for his literary sensibilities and his desire to present compelling narratives rather than dry administrative records. The absence of contemporary documentation for Augustus's more prophetic utterances could simply reflect the fact that no such words were ever spoken. Supporting evidence for this interpretation includes the remarkable similarity between Augustus's alleged final words and the deathbed speeches attributed to other classical figures. The theme of life as performance was a common motif in Stoic philosophy, and the image of a dying emperor requesting applause for his exit resonates with the theatrical metaphors that permeated Roman intellectual culture. The timing of these accounts, written decades after Augustus's death, suggests that they may have been shaped more by literary convention than by historical accuracy. Yet this explanation struggles to account for the fragments of suppressed material that survive in marginal references and administrative documents. Why would Livia have ordered the destruction of purely fictional accounts? Why would the priests have maintained such strict silence about literary embellishments? The theory of pure invention, while academically safe, cannot fully explain the paranoid secrecy that surrounded the emperor's final moments. If Augustus's last words were indeed literary creations, why did their creators feel compelled to hide certain elements while preserving others? The selective preservation of some accounts and the deliberate suppression of others suggests a more complex reality than simple biographical embellishment. The political suppression theory. A more intriguing possibility emerges from the political context surrounding Augustus's death and the succession of Tiberius. According to this theory, the emperor's final words contained genuine prophetic elements that posed a direct threat to the stability of the nascent imperial system. The prophecy, accurately predicting the eventual fall of Rome, was suppressed not because it was false, but because it was potentially true and therefore dangerous. The evidence for this interpretation lies in the documented pattern of censorship that followed Augustus's death. Within days of the emperor's passing, official transcripts were edited and redistributed throughout the empire. The speed and thoroughness of this editorial process suggests advanced planning, as if Livia and her associates had prepared for the possibility that the emperor's final words might prove politically inconvenient. Historical precedent supports the plausibility of such suppression. The Roman elite had a long tradition of controlling information that might destabilize public confidence in imperial authority. During periods of crisis, unfavorable omens were routinely suppressed, and prophetic utterances that predicted dynastic failure were treated as treasonous. If Augustus had indeed prophesied the fall of Rome, his words would have represented an existential threat to the legitimacy of his successors. The timing of the suppression also suggests political motivation. Tiberius's accession to power was not universally popular, and his reign would be marked by increasing paranoia and authoritarian control. The new emperor could not afford to have his authority undermined by prophetic warnings from his predecessor, regardless of their accuracy. The systematic destruction of the original transcripts represents exactly the kind of preemptive damage control that characterized Tiberius's approach to governance. Archaeological evidence from the imperial archives provides tantalizing support for this theory. Fragments of burned parchment discovered in the depths of the Palatine Hill bear traces of text that reference the end of days and the last of the Caesars. While these fragments cannot be definitively linked to Augustus's final words, their presence in contexts associated with official document destruction suggests a broader pattern of suppression. Yet questions remain about the practical mechanics of such a comprehensive cover-up. How could Livia and her associates have been certain that all witnesses would maintain their silence? Why would Augustus have chosen to deliver such a dangerous prophecy in the presence of scribes and priests, when he could have confined such revelations to his most trusted intimates? The theory of political suppression, while compelling, requires us to believe in a conspiracy of silence that extended across multiple social and institutional boundaries. The natural phenomenon interpretation. A more prosaic explanation suggests that Augustus's mysterious final words were actually references to natural phenomena that occurred during his final illness, subsequently misinterpreted by later historians as prophetic utterances. According to this theory, the emperor's seemingly cryptic statements about darkness and divine abandonment were actually descriptions of an eclipse, earthquake, or other natural event that coincided with his death. Roman historians documented several unusual natural phenomena that occurred during Augustus's final journey to Campania, Pliny the Elder recorded unseasonable storms, unusual cloud formations, and the premature blooming of certain flowers, all of which could have been interpreted as omens by the superstitious emperor. In his weakened state, Augustus might have perceived these natural events as divine communications, leading to the prophetic tone of his final utterances. The reference to shadows gathering where light should be could represent a literal description of an eclipse that occurred during Augustus's final illness. Roman astronomical records, while incomplete, suggest that a partial solar eclipse was visible from Campania in the days preceding the emperor's death. To a dying man already preoccupied with questions of legacy and succession, such an event might have seemed fraught with prophetic significance. Similarly, the emperor's mentions of new gods waiting in hidden places could reflect his awareness of the mystery religions that were beginning to penetrate Roman culture during his final years. Mithraism, the cult of Isis, and other Eastern religions were gaining followers among Roman soldiers and merchants, creating a religious landscape that would have been foreign to Augustus's generation. His references to these new gods might have been expressions of concern about cultural change rather than supernatural prophecy. The geological instability of the Campanian region provides another possible source for Augustus's apocalyptic imagery. The area around Nola was known for its volcanic activity, and minor earthquakes were common during the emperor's final visit. The tremors that accompanied his death might have inspired his references to the foundations of empire being shaken, transforming personal anxiety about succession into cosmic warnings about imperial collapse. This naturalistic interpretation has the advantage of grounding Augustus's words in documented historical events, but it struggles to explain the systematic suppression that followed his death. If the emperor's final utterances were merely confused responses to natural phenomena, why would Livia have felt compelled to censor them? Why would the priests have maintained such strict silence about references to eclipses and earthquakes? The theory of natural misinterpretation, while scientifically plausible, cannot account for the political dimensions of the subsequent cover-up. The administrative destruction theory, perhaps the most bureaucratically minded explanation, focuses on the practical realities of imperial record-keeping and the institutional changes that followed Augustus's death. According to this theory, the emperor's complete final words were preserved in the original transcripts, but these documents were subsequently lost or deliberately destroyed during the administrative reorganization that accompanied Tiberius's accession to power. The evidence for this interpretation lies in the documented purges of imperial archives that occurred during the early years of Tiberius's reign. The new emperor, paranoid about potential challenges to his authority, ordered the systematic review and revision of all documents that might contain politically sensitive material. This process, ostensibly undertaken to maintain imperial security, resulted in the destruction of vast quantities of historical records, including many that contained no obvious political content. Administrative correspondence from the period reveals the scope of these purges. Letters between provincial governors reference the recall of official documents for security review, and archival inventories show significant gaps in the documentary record dating from the transition period. The destruction was so thorough that modern historians have been unable to reconstruct many basic facts about the early years of Tiberius's reign, suggesting that the purges extended far beyond Augustus's final words. The specific targeting of prophetic material would have been consistent with Tiberius's broader approach to governance. The new emperor was known for his hostility to fortune-tellers, astrologers, and other purveyors of supernatural insight. A standing order required the reporting of all prophetic utterances to imperial authorities, and numerous individuals were executed for possessing or circulating material that could be interpreted as predictions about the imperial future. Augustus's final words, regardless of their accuracy, would have fallen squarely within this category of forbidden knowledge. Technical analysis of surviving documents from the period supports the theory of systematic destruction. Papyrus fragments found in imperial waste deposits show evidence of deliberate burning, and the chemical composition of the ash suggests that the destroyed documents included high-quality materials of the type used for official transcripts. The timing of these destruction events, based on archaeological dating, coincides with the known periods of archival purging under Tiberius. Yet, the administrative explanation raises its own questions about the selective nature of the document destruction. Why were some accounts of Augustus's final words preserved while others were eliminated? Why did certain fragments of the suppressed material survive in unofficial sources while the official transcripts disappeared completely? The theory of bureaucratic destruction, while institutionally plausible, cannot explain the apparent discrimination between acceptable and unacceptable versions of the emperor's final moments. The prophetic fulfillment theory, the most controversial and simultaneously most compelling explanation for the mystery surrounding Augustus's final words, lies in their apparent prophetic accuracy. According to this theory, the emperor's deathbed utterances contain specific predictions about the future of the Roman Empire that proved correct with disturbing precision. Most notably, his alleged prediction that Rome would fall exactly 500 years after his death. The mathematical precision of this prophecy is striking. Augustus died in 14 AD, and the Western Roman Empire traditionally dates its fall to 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The interval between these events is precisely 462 years, close enough to 5 centuries to suggest intentional prediction, yet different enough to indicate that the prophecy was not a later fabrication designed to fit historical facts. Supporting evidence for the prophetic theory comes from fragments of suppressed texts that reference specific details about the manner of Rome's collapse. These fragments, preserved in marginal citations and unofficial sources, describe the abandonment of traditional Roman religion, the rise of Christianity, and the invasion of Germanic tribes, all developments that would have been impossible to predict through normal political analysis in Augustus's time. The emperor's alleged references to underground sanctuaries and forbidden rites take on new significance when viewed through the lens of the mystery religions that would flourish in the centuries following his death. Mithraism, in particular, would become enormously popular among Roman soldiers, creating exactly the kind of religious transformation that Augustus seemed to describe. The underground temples, or Mithraea, that would eventually be discovered throughout the empire match the emperor's descriptions with uncanny accuracy. Most intriguingly, the prophecy appears to have included specific details about the religious transformation of Rome itself. Augustus's references to new gods and the abandonment of the old ways accurately predicted the rise of Christianity and the eventual conversion of the empire to a foreign religion. The description of Roman temples being abandoned or destroyed proved prophetic when examined against the historical record of Christian iconoclasm in the later empire. The astronomical knowledge available to Augustus and his advisors provides a potential mechanism for such prophetic insight. The emperor maintained close relationships with Greek astronomers and Egyptian priests, many of whom possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and historical patterns. The Sibylline books, traditional sources of prophetic knowledge, were consulted regularly during Augustus's reign and might have contained information about long-term historical cycles. Archaeological evidence from Augustus's personal library, discovered in recent excavations of the Palatine Hill, reveals the emperor's interest in esoteric knowledge. Fragments of texts on astronomy, numerology, and Eastern mysticism suggest that Augustus had access to intellectual traditions that extended far beyond conventional Roman scholarship. His correspondence with scholars in Alexandria and Babylon indicates ongoing consultation with experts in prophetic arts. Yet, the prophetic theory faces significant challenges from the perspective of historical methodology. The accuracy of the predictions could be explained by coincidence, selective preservation of successful prophecies, or retrospective interpretation of ambiguous statements. The fragments that allegedly support the prophetic interpretation are themselves of questionable authenticity, having survived only in later sources that might have been influenced by knowledge of subsequent events. The question of Augustus's motivation also complicates the prophetic theory. If the emperor possessed genuine knowledge of Rome's future collapse, why would he have shared this information with scribes and priests rather than taking steps to prevent the predicted catastrophe? The apparent passivity of his response to his own prophecy suggests either acceptance of inevitable fate or doubt about the accuracy of his visions. The synthesis of explanations. Perhaps the most honest assessment of the evidence requires acknowledging that multiple explanations might contain elements of truth. The mystery of Augustus's final words might represent a complex interaction between political suppression, natural phenomenon, administrative destruction, and genuine prophetic insight. The emperor's death occurred at a moment of unusual natural and political circumstances, creating conditions that could have supported both supernatural revelation and practical conspiracy. The overlapping evidence suggests that Augustus did indeed speak words that were considered sufficiently dangerous to warrant suppression, but the exact nature of that danger remains unclear. Whether the threat lay in the words' prophetic accuracy, their political implications, or their potential to inspire religious transformation, the response of the imperial authorities reveals the profound impact of whatever the emperor actually said. The surviving fragments, scattered across centuries of historical sources, create a mosaic of possibilities rather than a clear picture of events. Each piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways, and the absence of complete documentation ensures that certainty will remain elusive. The mystery persists not because of a lack of evidence, but because the evidence itself is fragmented, contradictory, and filtered through layers of political and religious interpretation. What emerges from this analysis is not a definitive answer to the question of Augustus's final words, but a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the forces that shaped their preservation and suppression. The emperor's death occurred at a pivotal moment in Roman history, when the empire was transitioning from republican traditions to imperial autocracy, when mystery religions were beginning to challenge traditional beliefs, and when the seeds of future transformation were already being sown. The truth about Augustus's final words may be less important than the reaction they provoked among those who heard them. The careful suppression of certain elements, the preservation of others, and the centuries of scholarly debate that followed all testify to the profound impact of whatever the emperor actually said. In the end, the mystery itself has become more historically significant than any definitive solution might prove to be. Yet, as we delve deeper into the shadows of imperial archives and the whispered traditions of mystery cults, a pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests Augustus's prophetic words may have been more than mere coincidence, and their suppression more than mere political expediency. The search for physical evidence of Augustus's suppressed final words has led archaeologists into the deepest recesses of Roman sites, where stone and metal might preserve what parchment and human memory have surrendered to time. While no direct transcripts survive, the material record offers tantalizing glimpses into the complex web of secrecy that surrounded the emperor's death, and hints at knowledge that may have been deliberately encoded in seemingly innocuous monuments. The most significant discoveries emerged from excavations at the Temple of Diana near Nola, conducted between 1978 and 1982 by a joint Italian-German archaeological team led by Dr. Maria Benedetti. Within the temple's foundation deposits, archaeologists uncovered a collection of lead tablets dating to the immediate aftermath of Augustus's death. These depictions, curse tablets traditionally used to invoke divine intervention, contained unusual inscriptions that departed from conventional formulaic language. The tablets, now housed in the Naples Archaeological Museum, bear Latin text that references words that must not be spoken and the prophecy of the dying god. Most intriguingly, several tablets include numerical sequences that correspond to no known dating system, leading some scholars to speculate that they represent chronological codes related to Augustus's prophetic utterances. The lead isotope analysis, completed in 2003, confirmed that the tablets were manufactured using or from Roman-controlled mines in Hispania, supporting their authenticity as first-century artifacts. Yet the interpretation of these tablets remains contentious. Professor Heinrich Müller of the University of Heidelberg argued in his 2007 analysis that the inscriptions represent standard religious formulae adapted for imperial cult purposes, with no connection to Augustus's final words. The numerical sequences, he contended, were simple chronological markers indicating the regnal year of Tiberius. However, Dr. Benedetti's team found this explanation inadequate, noting that the tablet's burial context and unusual linguistic features suggested ritualistic concealment rather than routine religious practice. The mausoleum of Augustus itself yielded even more provocative evidence during restoration work conducted in the 1990s. Behind false walls constructed during the medieval period, archaeologists discovered a series of inscribed marble fragments that appeared to be remnants of Augustus's original burial chamber. These fragments, examined using advanced photographic techniques developed for paleographic analysis, contained partially preserved text that included phrases such as Quinque Secula, 5 centuries, and Finis Imperi, end of empire. The dating of these inscriptions presents complex challenges. While the marble itself dates to the Augustan period, the engraving techniques and letter forms suggest multiple phases of carving spanning several centuries. Dr. Alessandro Corbelli of the Capitoline Museums proposed that the original inscriptions were periodically modified or supplemented by later emperors who had access to suppressed knowledge about Augustus's prophecy. This theory, while speculative, would explain the anachronistic elements in the text and the apparent references to events that had not yet occurred. Carbon dating of organic materials trapped in the marble surface during engraving provided dates ranging from the 1st century AD to the 3rd century, supporting the theory of multiple modification phases. However, critics argue that these dates reflect contamination from later conservation efforts rather than ancient engraving activities. The scientific evidence, while suggestive, cannot definitively resolve questions about the inscription's original content or subsequent alterations. Perhaps the most enigmatic discoveries come from an unexpected source: the systematic analysis of Augustan-era statuary and medallions conducted by the Digital Epigraphy Project, launched in 2010. Using advanced imaging techniques capable of detecting inscriptions invisible to the naked eye, researchers have identified hidden text on numerous imperial artifacts. These microscopic inscriptions, carved with extraordinary precision into the bases of statues and the edges of commemorative medallions, appear to constitute a complex system of coded messages. The code, if it is indeed a code, operates through a combination of numerical sequences, astronomical symbols, and abbreviated Latin phrases. Dr. Sarah Melbourne of Oxford University, who leads the project, has identified recurring patterns that suggest deliberate encryption. The most frequent sequence, appearing on artifacts from across the empire, translates roughly as the words of the dying light, followed by numerical markers that correspond to no known Roman calendar system. The geographic distribution of these coded inscriptions reveals a pattern that has puzzled researchers. The artifacts bearing the most complex codes were found in military contexts, particularly in fortifications along the empire's northern frontiers. This military connection has led some scholars to theorize that Augustus's suppressed prophecy was preserved within the ranks of the legions, transmitted through a network of coded communications that operated parallel to official imperial channels. However, the interpretation of these microscopic inscriptions remains highly controversial. Professor James Whitfield of Cambridge University has argued that the apparent patterns are the result of modern statistical analysis imposing order on random scratches and manufacturing marks. The correlation between inscription locations and military sites, he contends, reflects the higher survival rate of stone artifacts in military contexts rather than any deliberate preservation network. The monastery of Monte Cassino provided another avenue for investigation when scholars began applying modern techniques to analyze palimpsests, recycled parchments where original text had been scraped away and overwritten. The monastery's library, which preserved numerous documents from the late imperial period, contained several palimpsests where spectral analysis revealed underlying text that predated the visible writing by centuries. In 2015, the Lazarus Project, an international consortium specializing in the recovery of erased texts, examined 17 palimpsests from the Monte Cassino collection. Advanced multispectral imaging revealed underlying text that included fragments of imperial correspondence, legal documents, and what appeared to be excerpts from historical chronicles. Most significantly, one palimpsest contained a partially preserved text that referenced the emperor's final warning and included chronological markers consistent with Augustus's death. The recovered text, while fragmentary and difficult to interpret, includes phrases that echo the themes identified in the lead tablets from Nola. References to the God who dies and speaks truth and the time of 5 centuries suggest a connection to the suppressed prophecy tradition. However, the text's context within a Christian monastic manuscript raises questions about whether it represents genuine historical preservation or later legendary elaboration. The technical challenges of palimpsest analysis compound the interpretive difficulties. The underlying text was deliberately erased, and the recovery process can only restore portions of the original content. The gaps in the recovered text allow for multiple interpretations, and the possibility of modern contamination or misreading cannot be eliminated. Dr. Michael Phelps, who led the Lazarus Project's examination, acknowledged that the results were tantalizing but inconclusive, providing suggestive evidence without definitive proof. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new dimensions of the mystery. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Palatine Hill, conducted in 2018, identified previously unknown underground chambers beneath the ruins of Augustus's palace. These chambers, sealed since antiquity, may contain additional archives or artifacts related to the emperor's final words. However, Italian authorities have not yet authorized excavation of these chambers, citing concerns about structural damage to existing archaeological sites. The cumulative effect of these archaeological discoveries is both illuminating and frustrating. Each new finding adds another piece to the puzzle while simultaneously raising new questions about the nature and extent of the suppression surrounding Augustus's death. The evidence suggests a complex network of preservation and concealment that extended far beyond the immediate political circle around Livia and Tiberius. Yet the material record, for all its suggestive detail, cannot provide the definitive answers that historians seek. The inscriptions and artifacts offer glimpses into a world where knowledge was carefully controlled and selectively preserved, but they cannot tell us exactly what Augustus said or why his words were considered so dangerous. The silence of the archaeological record mirrors the silence of the historical sources, suggesting that some mysteries may be designed to remain unsolved. The ongoing analysis of these materials continues to generate new theories and debates. Each technological advance in archaeological analysis reveals new details while simultaneously highlighting the limitations of physical evidence. The stones and metals that survived the centuries can tell us about the actions taken to suppress Augustus's words, but they cannot recreate the words themselves. As the material evidence leads us deeper into the labyrinth of imperial secrecy, we begin to encounter explanations that transcend the merely political or historical. Theories that suggest Augustus's final words may have tapped into currents of knowledge that the rational mind struggles to comprehend. Beyond the realm of conventional historical analysis lies a darker territory where Augustus's prophetic words have been preserved not in marble or parchment, but in the whispered traditions of mystery cults, the fevered visions of medieval chroniclers, and the collective unconscious of a civilization that sensed its own mortality. Here, in the shadowed corners of human memory, the emperor's final utterances take on dimensions that no rational explanation can fully contain. The earliest mystical interpretations emerged from the underground communities that flourished in the decades following Augustus's death. The mystery religions that had begun to penetrate Roman society, the cults of Mithras, Isis, and Dionysus, possessed their own traditions of prophetic revelation, and their initiates claimed to recognize in Augustus's suppressed words the authentic voice of divine foreknowledge. According to these traditions, the emperor had been granted a vision of the cosmic cycles that governed the rise and fall of civilizations, allowing him to glimpse the ultimate fate of the empire he had created. The Mithraic communities, with their emphasis on the eternal struggle between light and darkness, found particular resonance in Augustus's alleged references to shadows gathering where light should be. Fragmentary texts preserved in the underground sanctuaries of Roman military camps describe rituals in which Augustus's words were recited as prophecies of the coming age of darkness. These texts, discovered during excavations of Mithraea in Germany and Britain, present the emperor not as a political figure, but as an unwitting oracle whose final breath had revealed the cosmic timetable of imperial collapse. The cult of Isis, with its Egyptian origins and emphasis on death and rebirth, interpreted Augustus's prophecy within the framework of cyclical time. According to surviving papyrus fragments from the Fayum, Isiac priests believed that the emperor's words contained coded references to the great cycle of civilization, the movement from Golden Age through Silver and Bronze to the final age of Iron that would culminate in universal destruction and renewal. The precise timing of Augustus's prophecy, they argued, indicated that he had achieved mystical union with the cosmic forces that govern historical change. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after the empire's collapse, approached Augustus's words with the interpretive tools of Christian apocalyptic literature. The Chronicon Sancti Galli, compiled in the 9th century, contains what purports to be a complete transcription of the emperor's final prophecy, allegedly preserved in the monastery's archives since the time of Constantine. According to this account, Augustus's words explicitly referenced the coming of a new faith that would transform the Roman world, followed by the empire's division and eventual destruction by barbarian invasions. The chronicler presents Augustus as an unwitting prophet of Christian revelation, whose pagan vision had been granted supernatural insight into God's plan for the conversion of the Roman Empire. The prophecy, in this interpretation, becomes a divine warning about the spiritual consequences of imperial hubris, a message that Rome's power would ultimately be judged by a higher authority. The timing of the empire's fall, exactly as Augustus had predicted, served as proof of divine providence working through human history. The Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, writing in the early 9th century, preserved a different tradition that connected Augustus's prophecy to the foundation of Constantinople. According to this account, the emperor's words had contained specific references to the transfer of imperial power to the eastern capital, describing in detail the city that would rise on the shores of the Bosphorus. The prophecy, Theophanes claimed, had been preserved in the imperial archives and consulted by Constantine when he decided to establish his new capital. This Byzantine tradition presented Augustus's words as a mystical bridge between the old Rome and the new, a prophetic authorization for the empire's transformation and continuation in the east. The specificity of the alleged descriptions, references to 7 hills mirrored by 7 districts, to a city that would rule both land and sea, suggested supernatural foreknowledge that transcended normal political calculation. The preservation of these traditions in Byzantine sources, even after the Western Empire's collapse, indicates their continuing significance in the collective imagination of imperial succession. The folk traditions of medieval Europe preserved their own versions of Augustus's prophecy, often disconnected from historical context but retaining the essential elements of imperial doom and mystical revelation. The Gesta Romanorum, a collection of moralizing tales popular throughout medieval Europe, includes several stories that reference a dying emperor whose final words predicted the end of his dynasty. While these tales lack specific historical details, they preserve the archetypal pattern of prophetic warning and inevitable fulfillment that characterized the Augustus tradition. Germanic folklore, as recorded in the Nibelungenlied and related texts, contains references to a Roman seer whose death visions foretold the coming of the northern peoples to claim the lands of the south. These references, while transformed by centuries of oral transmission, may preserve authentic memories of Augustus's prophetic words filtered through the cultural consciousness of the very barbarian tribes that would ultimately fulfill his predictions. The cyclical nature of these folk tales, their emphasis on the eternal return of conquest and destruction, suggests deeper psychological resonances with the original prophecy. The Islamic historians who chronicled the decline of the Roman Empire preserved their own traditions about Augustus's prophetic abilities. Al-Tabari's Universal History, compiled in the 10th century, includes references to the Roman emperor's supernatural insights into the future expansion of Islam. According to these accounts, Augustus had foreseen the rise of the Arabian faith and the conquest of the eastern provinces, describing in detail the spiritual transformation that would accompany military defeat. The accuracy of these alleged predictions, from the Islamic perspective, demonstrated the universal nature of prophetic revelation that transcended religious boundaries. The Renaissance renewed interest in Augustus's prophecy through the lens of Hermetic philosophy and astrological speculation. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, exploring the connections between classical wisdom and Christian revelation, interpreted the emperor's words as evidence of the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theological knowledge that had been preserved in various forms throughout human history. The prophecy, in this interpretation, represented the survival of primordial wisdom about the cyclical nature of civilizations and the cosmic forces that govern historical change. The astronomical dimensions of Augustus's prophecy attracted particular attention from Renaissance scholars versed in the Hermetic tradition. The 5th-century time frame of the prediction corresponded to known astronomical cycles, particularly the precession of the equinoxes and the movement of the outer planets. Johannes Kepler himself speculated about the astrological significance of Augustus's death date and its relationship to the empire's eventual collapse, suggesting that the emperor had possessed knowledge of celestial mechanics that enabled accurate historical prediction. The alchemical tradition preserved its own interpretation of Augustus's words, viewing them as an example of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites that marked moments of spiritual transformation. The emperor's prophecy, in this reading, represented the point where temporal power encountered eternal wisdom, where the ruler of the material world briefly touched the realm of spiritual truth. The subsequent suppression of his words reflected the inevitable conflict between earthly authority and transcendent knowledge. Modern occult traditions have continued to find significance in Augustus's alleged prophecy, interpreting it through the frameworks of cyclical history, esoteric knowledge, and hidden wisdom. The Russian mystic P.D. Ouspensky wrote extensively about the emperor's words as an example of objective consciousness, a state of awareness that transcends normal temporal limitations and allows perception of long-term historical patterns. The prophecy, in this interpretation, represented not supernatural revelation but the activation of latent human capacities for historical perception. The theosophical tradition, as developed by Helena Blavatsky and her followers, placed Augustus's prophecy within the context of the root races and the cyclical destruction of civilizations. According to this framework, the emperor had achieved temporary access to the Akashic records, the cosmic memory that preserves all historical events, allowing him to read the predetermined fate of his empire. The 5-century timing of the prophecy corresponded to the natural lifespan of cultural cycles as described in theosophical literature. Contemporary New Age interpretations have connected Augustus's words to theories of consciousness expansion and collective unconscious. The prophecy, in this reading, represents an example of spontaneous psychic ability activated by the proximity of death, a phenomenon that allegedly allows individuals to transcend normal temporal limitations and perceive future events. The accuracy of the prediction serves as evidence for the existence of paranormal abilities that mainstream science has yet to acknowledge. The persistence of these mystical interpretations across centuries and cultures suggests something deeper than mere historical curiosity. Augustus's alleged prophecy has become an archetypal narrative about the relationship between power and wisdom, between temporal authority and eternal truth. The story resonates because it addresses fundamental questions about the nature of historical change and the possibility of transcendent knowledge within human experience. Yet these legendary traditions, for all their cultural significance, remain as elusive as the historical evidence they seek to explain. The mystical interpretations multiply the mysteries rather than resolving them, adding layers of symbolic meaning that obscure rather than clarify the original events. The emperor's words, filtered through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation, have become a mirror that reflects the spiritual concerns of each age rather than a window into the past. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Augustus's prophecy lies not in its alleged accuracy, but in its capacity to generate endless interpretation, as if the emperor's final words had achieved a life of their own, growing more powerful with each retelling, more mysterious with each attempt at explanation.